History is full of wars that happen for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes wars are a last resort, other times they are the first option amongst a raft of other options. War can be resorted to because one's enemy is vulnerable, because one's ally wouldn't expect such a dastardly act, or because one is simply bored at home with this big army and all these plans and nobody to share them with. In circumstances such as these, diplomacy almost certainly fails. My name is Zach, and this is When Diplomacy Fails' first ever video, in which we examine 5 times diplomacy failed. Whether it was human blunders, misunderstanding, pure ambition, national honour, or the balance of power that caused the diplomacy to fail, the one constant in each of these events is that when diplomacy did fail, war was the result. To start us off, number 5, the Franco-Prussian War. Ah yes, the Franco-Prussians. Always disagreeing, always posturing, sometimes warring. The Franco-German relationship is a complicated one. Only very recently, in terms of the actual length of their relationship, have the two powers decided to take over the world together. Until that point, though, they were determined enemies, even since medieval times, when tiny German principalities swore allegiance to the Holy Roman Emperor for protection against yet another opportunistic French king and his ambitions. As the years progressed, these French monarchs were swept aside with the tide of history to be replaced by a republican, imperial polity that competed regularly with the British in Africa and across the world for trade and influence. Similarly, the Germans had long since abandoned their minute, headache-inducing structure and had bandied together over the years to form larger but still disunited princely states, with regions such as Saxony, Bavaria, and Prussia holding most of the cards. All of these powers were still important players in Central Europe, and they were vital for developing a sense of European German culture and identity, but each were minnows in the ocean of world powers that existed by 1870. Determined to change all this was Otto von Bismarck, an insanely ambitious, tenacious, and skilled individual, consumed with one goal: making his homeland the greatest of all the German states, and unifying Germany under that homeland's banner. The name of Otto von Bismarck's homeland? Prussia. That kingdom on the fringes of Europe, which had spent the last few centuries building up its strength, reputation, and influence to reach the position of leader of Germany's varied states. Only very recently had such a dramatic change in the European status quo occurred. In 1864, Bismarck had authorized and planned a strike against Denmark, carving out for Prussia nice swathes of Schleswig-Holstein. This booty led almost directly to the next war, with some prodding from Bismarck, with Austria. After shockingly winning this war against Austria in 1866, Bismarck's Prussia seemed destined to hold all the German cards. But there was a problem. In Bismarck's case, the task wasn't yet complete. Some German states, in particular Bavaria, and those that had originally clustered around Austria, were slow in uniting under his Prussian banner of total German unification. Bismarck wasn't the only one with a problem, though. France had been ruled since the early 1850s by Napoleon III, a nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. During the chaos of the 1848 revolutions, which swept across Europe, the French people had adopted the late Napoleon's nephew as their new national saviour. Napoleon I had waged war against the world for 2 decades and had crafted a French superstate in the process, and his nephew appealed to this glorious past. Yet, by 1870, Napoleon III had mostly failed to live up to his own hype. He had participated in the Crimean War alongside Britain against Russia in the 1850s, and his forces had infamously invaded Mexico in a failed bid to establish an empire there. But now he was faced with a problem closer to home. For centuries, the Germans had fought separately, or amongst themselves. Now they seemed more unified, and therefore more dangerous than ever before. In the space of less than a decade, everything had changed to France's east, and something had to be done. In Napoleon III's mind, war was the solution, a great war which would prove the military prowess of his nation, bolster his regime's popularity, and stunt the growth of German nationalism. What Napoleon III didn't seem to have accounted for, though, was the fact that Bismarck was looking for a war as well, but a defensive war which would bind the remaining German states to Prussia, and thus complete the unification of all German states at the centre of Europe. To bring about a war, Bismarck needed to make Napoleon III declare war on him, so that he could appeal to the separated Germans and organise the final act of unification under Berlin's banner. But where could he find the pretext? He couldn't publicly goad Napoleon III into making war, since that would be too obvious. In the era of 1870, whatever one's ambitions, a pretext was necessary if one wanted to make war, especially if that war was to take place in Europe. Such protocols were in place for the sake of motivation and unity at home, as well as reputation abroad. Then, almost out of the blue it seemed, a solution or pretext emerged as the answer to Bismarck's plans. Revolution in Spain throughout the 1860s meant that the Spanish were on the lookout for a new monarch by 1870. A few candidates were suggested, but by far the most contentious was Leopold, Prince of Hohenzollern, member of a branch of the ruling Prussian dynasty and a German prince who would go on to provide heirs to the throne of Romania, of all places. To Napoleon III, this candidate was unacceptable, since it would surround France in a Protestant German Hohenzollern grip which his nation could not tolerate, and so deliberations continued as tensions between the belligerent French and plotting Prussians reached a fever pitch. In the event, Leopold declared his intentions to turn down the throne of Spain, but to some in France this was not enough. The French foreign minister instructed his ambassador in Berlin to approach the Prussian king Wilhelm I and demand that Wilhelm would never allow a Hohenzollern candidate to sit upon the Spanish throne. To this, Wilhelm refused as politely as he could, understanding that the demand was a French attempt to claw back prestige in a diplomatic sphere. The French ambassador left the scene, and an account was drawn up of the event, whereupon this account was sent to Bismarck. This telegram contained all the details from the conversations between Wilhelm and the French ambassador, and Bismarck immediately saw his chance to bring about a war. He edited the document, removing any ounce of politeness on behalf of Wilhelm, and finding a way to emphasise, without actually adding any words, the fact that French demands had been refused. Thus the infamous Ems Dispatch was born. When this inflammatory document was leaked back to France, and Napoleon III as well as the French people were made aware of it, rioting erupted in Paris as thousands demanded a war with Prussia. Napoleon obliged, and in mid-July 1870, declarations were made by both Napoleon and the French Parliament to the effect that Prussia and France were now in a state of war. Everything had gone according to plan, and Prussia now had the defensive war that it needed. The German states to the south rallied to Bismarck's side and invaded French territory faster than French soldiers could repulse them or answer their challenge. In a series of running battles, culminating in the Battle of Sedan on the 2nd of September 1870, where Napoleon III himself was captured. The French were utterly destroyed. It got worse. The German Empire was proclaimed in early 1871, with Prussia now dominant over all the German states, and the balance of power upset even more than it had been, with a huge German Empire now at the heart of Europe. Thus, the stage was set for the Franco-German rivalry, which would culminate in the First World War. Number 4. The Franco-Dutch War. That's right, France strikes again. This time we have a very different set of circumstances though, and a very different kind of France making the war. This was a France ruled by a young and ambitious king, Louis XIV. A man infamous nowadays for bringing France to the top of the European food chain, and for being the Sun King since the world revolved around him. In this case, Louis made the decision to wage war on the Dutch. Today, the Dutch are a perfectly lovely people, and the Netherlands is a perfectly lovely place to visit. But in 1672, the Dutch United Provinces of the Netherlands were a major economic and military power, with trade routes snaking across the world, and with a reputation for military prowess and tenacity earned from a century of war against their original masters, Spain. To cut a long story short, Louis was a monarch of his age, and strikes me as the kind of guy who would have gotten bored in total war or civilization unless he was either planning to make war or conducting war against somebody. In this case, Louis wanted war for the sake of his own personal glory. He wanted a short war, a victorious war, and a war which would reap France great economic benefits. At the top of these benefits, Louis anticipated, was the supplanting of the Dutch at the top of the world economic food chain. How did he plan to achieve this? Well, by invading and seizing the Dutch homeland, of course. It was a plan as dastardly as it was simple, since for years the Dutch and French had fought side by side, and up until recently had enjoyed the benefits of an alliance. By 1672 though, Louis had grown tired of the wealthy Dutch and their meddling ways. In the late 1660s, the Dutch had joined with other concerned powers to oppose Louis's expansion in the Spanish Netherlands. Thus, in Louis's mind, he could never enjoy success until he destroyed the root of the problem, and that root was located in the Protestant epicenter of Europe, the Netherlands. From a combination of motives then, economic, the pursuit of glory, and revenge, Louis XIV orchestrated a war against his Dutch neighbour. The war was declared in April 1672, but Louis was not alone. Through money, diplomacy, and sheer force of personality, he had flipped the old Dutch allies against their former friend. Though the diplomacy had failed, insofar as war had now erupted, Louis had succeeded diplomatically as well, since he had persuaded England to wage its third war against the Dutch Empire in a generation, using English ships to tip the balance in Louis's favour at sea, while the Swedish Empire agreed to pressure its German neighbours in the event that they tried to come to the aid of the Netherlands. At first, everything went swimmingly for Louis. The Dutch defences collapsed, the Dutch government collapsed, the Dutch armies collapsed. But after a year of collapses, in what the Dutch later referred to as the Year of Disaster or Rampjaar, the tables began to turn. Louis had thoroughly underestimated both his own Dutch foe and the opposition he would face from Europe. After Louis turned down an advantageous peace from the desperate Dutch a year into the war, more European powers made it their business to get involved, with the Holy Roman Empire, Prussia, and Spain weighing in. The war dragged on until 1678, and the short, beneficial war that Louis had envisioned went up in smoke, replaced by a stalemate and limited gains once peace was finally achieved. Though he was discouraged, Louis would strike again, and this war is widely seen as the first in a trio of essentially world wars which Louis would unleash upon Europe, cementing his reputation as the Sun King in the process. Number 3. The Crimean War. Nowadays, the Crimea is a somewhat hot topic, but in the 1850s it was an even hotter affair, with the alliance of France, the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, and Sardinia fighting a war against an ambitious Russia in the name of pushing the expanding Russians back and preserving the balance of power in Europe. It was perhaps the most blatant time, up to that point, that Europe had stepped in to contain the expanding Russians, who since the end of the Napoleonic Wars had established themselves as a premier power in their own right, and posed a serious threat to Britain's dominance across the Far East and in India. With the promised aid of the French under Napoleon III, we met him earlier on, the decision was made to declare war on the Russians in October 1853. For months before the actual declaration of war, arguments over who could claim to stand for the rights of Eastern Christians were debated by the French and the Russians. The Russians claimed to speak for the Eastern Orthodox. The French claimed to speak for the Catholics. Though the churches themselves worked the argument out, since it was mostly a pointless argument anyway, as neither the French nor the Russians possessed any soldiers on the ground in the Ottoman Empire to police the region and force the issue, the Russian Tsar Nicholas I and the French Emperor Napoleon III both felt unable to back down. Some historians believe that the religious element was merely a smokescreen for the real battle, that of influence. Both the French and especially the Russians had grand ambitions to expand in the area held by the Ottoman Empire. For Russia, Constantinople was the grand prize, and to acquire such a prize, Russian shipbuilders had been busy crafting a navy in the Black Sea, which they could use to fortify that region as a sphere of influence for St. Petersburg. A great deal of trade passed through the Dardanelles, and to protect this, perhaps even with a view towards taking it and holding it, Tsar Nicholas I was persuaded that a stiff policy was necessary. In the case of the French, as well as the British, it was clear by the mid-19th century that the Ottoman Empire was a declining state. Rather than allow the region to collapse in the event of a fierce Russian assault, officials from both countries opted to maintain or prop up the region. This decision was the crux of what became known as the Eastern Question, and it would resurface time and again over the course of the 19th century, only really disappearing with the outbreak of the First World War. It was feared that the Russians would take advantage of the Ottoman decline and pour into the Balkans, seize the Dardanelles, and control those lucrative trade routes, upsetting the balance of power there and increasing their already considerable power. So a coalition against such an eventuality was set up. The Ottomans opened hostilities with the understanding that the coalition would follow, and soon the Russians had a serious problem on their hands. Rather than bow immediately to the overwhelming numbers though, the Russian resistance ensured that the war dragged on for 3 years. Additionally, despite the greater resources and abilities of the coalition allies, the war is known today for its wasteful losses during horrendous campaigns. Charge of the Light Brigade, anyone? While under the command of bumbling generals, charge of the Light Brigade, anyone? As well as the awful sanitary conditions and medical capabilities of all involved, which made the situation on the ground miserable for the average soldier. Good thing lessons were learned from this war and, wait. Well, number 2, the breakdown of the Peace of Amiens in 1803. Okay, so this war is a little less straightforward, but it actually formed part of the Napoleonic Wars that I've banged on about already. By 1802, Europe was in a state of peace. It was an uneasy peace for sure, as a victorious Napoleonic France had basically forced its enemies, including Britain, to accept tough terms and swallow a set of conditions which basically ensured French European predominance. Britain had spent an awful lot of money since the French revolutions broke out in 1789 and had nothing to show for it, save an all-powerful dictator on their doorstep. But their allies had been systematically defeated in the years since, and pressure was mounting at home for peace. Channels were opened with the French in mid-1801, and after much negotiations, a treaty was hammered out. Almost immediately though, problems were apparent. One of the terms of the peace treaty required a British evacuation of Malta, its critically important naval base in the Mediterranean, while another required no further expansion of French territory, a requirement complicated by the French invasion of Switzerland at the time of the peace negotiations. Nonetheless, by the 12th of October 1801, peace was unilaterally declared. It would only last until May 1803, and here's why. Though peace had been made, relations rapidly soured between Britain and France. Malta was one reason, as was Switzerland, as we've seen, but the language of both and their previously held views were other major stumbling blocks. Napoleon upheld that since Britain was an island nation, it held no justifiable claims to Europe, and thus had to butt out. A notion which the British balked at, since their ruling monarch, George III, was also an elector of Hanover in the Holy Roman Empire, and thus held more than just a small stake in what went on in Europe. Napoleon also made a series of demands on the British press, insisting that they suppress any paper which depicted him or his empire in a negative or mocking light. The British had certainly been guilty of publishing such papers, but they could never bow to such demands, lest they be seen to compromise their own sovereignty. With the lifting of the blockade on France, French ships were sent abroad to recapture old dependencies in Haiti and reinforce French authority in the Americas. This made British officials wary, as did the annexations of some of Napoleon's new client republics into the French Empire proper. To the British public, France seemed to be benefiting from the peace, while Britain seemed to be giving everything. It was a state of affairs which could not be tolerated. Napoleon continued to be seen as the greatest threat to Britain despite the peace, and, no matter the Pacific language used or concessions granted, this perception never truly went away. In a series of public meetings, Napoleon made some ill-advised threats against Britain's positions in Egypt and Malta, as well as Hanover, and this was seen as the last straw. By March 1803, the Russian Tsar, Alexander, was already preparing his soldiers in the Baltic, as hostilities seemed inevitable there once again. With the Peace of Amiens on the rocks, an ultimatum was sent to France in early May 1803, demanding an evacuation of the Netherlands and Switzerland, and approval for a British occupation of Malta. When these terms were inevitably refused, the war between the British Empire and Napoleonic France resumed again, and the brief period of peace was at an end. The Napoleonic Wars were back on, because Britain came to the conclusion that it could never tolerate the all-powerful Napoleon Bonaparte on its doorstep without directly opposing his bid for domination of the European continent. The years that followed would see additional coalitions, rise and fall, incredible victories, bitter defeats, and heroic campaigns. But none of these would ever have taken place had diplomacy not failed during the Peace of Amiens. And number 1, the First World War. Who's surprised? Widely renowned as perhaps the greatest diplomatic blunder of human history, this war is one I have covered extensively in my podcasts. See the July Crisis in the links below if you're interested, and it is also one that still profoundly interests me. There's just so much going on, and this is the reason why so many historians have found so much mileage on the subject. With the passing of the centenary of the outbreak of the First World War in 2014, casual interest was increased regarding the question of why it all happened, and this is one that we as historians are still, over a century later, grappling with. The outbreak of the Great War was caused by a series of diplomatic failures and the culmination of years of ignorance and fear on all sides. We don't have time to go into a load of detail here. Once again, see the link down below. But the First World War, at its beginning, had 5 major players: the British, the Russians, the French, the Austrians, and the Germans. All of these players had something to do with the outbreak of the war, and none are totally blameless. It is important also to remember that the nations of 1914 lived in a very different world to us now. This was a world where national honour and the reputed power of one's moustache, army, that's right, got more done at the negotiating table than actual proper negotiating. Everyone wanted a short war. A war which would damage one's enemies, or end encirclement, or recoup lost prestige, or usher in a new golden age. As the war dragged in more and more nations, the reasons for its original eruption became lost in the rhetoric that was required to ensure its continuation. Additionally, as more and more resources, lives, and monies were lost trying to fight it, the actual questioning of its origins became less important, and in its aftermath, people instead tried to find some significance in the loss. The First World War is thus important because of what it can tell us about human nature. On the one hand, you had a guy like Franz Ferdinand, who had great plans for the future of his Empire of Austria, where he wanted to unite all the Slavs, the Germans, the Hungarians, whoever and wherever they were, and work together for the common good. Yet, he was killed by a Serbian separatist, and his assassination provided the spark which ignited the tinderbox of Europe into a war of unimaginable scale. Then you look at a country like Britain, which for years had identified itself as separate from Europe, as possessing an empire which stretched across the world and defined the British Empire as the first power of the world, with no equal. Its people were cosmopolitan, looking to the New World or their dominions, not necessarily Europe, as the place for Britain to expend its resources. Yet, despite this, in the space of a week, the British government managed to persuade most of its people to support British involvement in the European war that had erupted. To do this, they had to exercise some impressive propaganda talents, but they also had to paint the war in noble terms. Britain was coming to Belgium's rescue. It was standing up for small nations, not you, Ireland. It was standing up for moral principles. This story in of itself is incredible, because to create such a story they had to demonize Germany, a power which did not hold the straightforwardly hostile attitudes towards Britain that you might think. With the end of the naval race between Britain and Germany, and the increasing tensions between Britain and Russia, if anyone was going to be London's friend before the outbreak of the First World War happened, it was going to be Berlin. Dispatches from British civil servants scattered across Europe offering their opinions on where Britain should invest its diplomatic energies in next, regularly pointed to a German partnership. A new deal based on family ties, mutual interests, and similar fears. Such commonality had enabled Britain and France, historically two mortal enemies, to stand side by side in an ill-defined agreement, so how hard could it be? Britain's royal family hosted German blood. Its bloodline descended from Hanover, a princely German state, and its current royal had a cousin in Wilhelm II. Such imaginings could have led to any number of alternative histories, but the war broke out before such events could be allowed to take place. Some diplomats, some organisations, some monarchs, and some newspapers did urge for the peace to be held together, but when Austrian officials reasoned that they had to act now against the wily Serbs or lose prestige in the aftermath of Franz Ferdinand's assassination, the very alliance bloc system that caution and fear of one's enemies had set in place caused a series of chain reactions that nobody seemed capable of stopping. As Austria attacked Serbia, Serbia's ally Russia prepared to defend her in the form of provocatively mobilizing on the Austro-German borders. When no reply to its warnings were received, Germany's government considered itself in a state of war with Russia. But instead of leaving it at that and continuing with mobilizations, a uniquely German sense of legal propriety required German Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg to approve a declaration of war against both Russia and soon after its partner, France. France, it was reasoned, would soon be attacked anyway as per Germany's Schlieffen Plan, which required a short campaign in France and then a swing towards Russia to finish off the Entente. The Schlieffen Plan, though, was terrible, and basically ensured that Germany would appear the aggressor to foreign opinion, as it would have to travel through Belgium in order to get to France's exposed frontier. Thus we come to the issue of Britain, where rousing conversations and heady speeches were made on August the 3rd, 1914, urging war in the name of smaller nations, when the less appealing call for war in the name of the French partner failed to make much of an impression. By this stage, it wasn't so much the case that everybody wanted war, but instead that nobody seemed willing to resort to diplomacy to solve the laundry list of problems that each now had with their own enemies. Nobody could risk a Pacific policy because they feared what they might lose: the strategic initiative, national prestige, national honour. In an atmosphere of paranoia, where one's rivals became one's plotting enemies, urgency and swiftness were key. And in such an emergency, diplomacy wasn't given time to succeed, and was thus doomed to fail. And that's our list. What springs to mind when you think of diplomacy failing? Please let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and share this video, since it'll make me happy. If you're interested in finding out more about the topics we've covered here, please remember to follow whatever links that are available below to the wars we've encountered before, where you can actually listen to free, full-length podcasts on them in more detail, whether you're running, walking the dog or ironing. When Diplomacy Fails podcast will be there. Thanks for watching. I have been Zach, and I'll be seeing you soon.